In the past week, you might have noticed that there was this media narrative sort of concocted, seemingly out of whole cloth, that all of a sudden it was alleged Republican elected officials had decided that it was a good idea to get the COVID vaccine, and it was a good idea to start promoting that their constituents get the COVID vaccine. And now this stream and this kind of angle of analysis that I'm about to present to you doesn't really have anything to do with whether it's advisable or not to get the COVID vaccine. For personal disclosure reasons, as I've said many times, I personally have got the vaccine. I got it in April. In general terms, I would encourage others to get it. Seems like a reasonable thing to do given the cost-benefit analysis, but that's not what I'm focusing on here at all. I'm focusing on the outright fakery that was the basis for this invented, manufactured media narrative in light of the latest round of outsized attention, you might say, on the issue of COVID or the state of the pandemic or whatnot. So last week, you could see it percolating on social media, actually. You could see the origins, as is so often the case, of this kind of artificial narrative generating in bits and pieces on social media, namely Twitter. And the idea was that because the so-called Delta variant is increasing in prevalence in highly Republican areas or Republican-heavy states like Missouri or Arkansas or Alabama, out of the blue, it was told, Republican elected officials got the religion on the vaccine and began belatedly promoting vaccine uptake. And this was construed in such a way as to depict these Republican elected officials as extremely irresponsible or reckless because supposedly it took them so very long to begin promoting the vaccines in earnest. And while it is true that in the past week or so, a number of high-profile Republican elected officials reiterated their support for vaccine uptake, reiterated their general position vis-a-vis the vaccine, which is that it's safe and effective and people should take it, the idea that that was somehow new or somehow only emerged last week due to some cynical calculation or some underhanded political logic, that's just entirely false. And I think the falsity of that narrative, which was promulgated all over the place, I mean, the usual suspects on Twitter were just asserting it as though it were gospel. You saw, countless segments on, corporate media predicated on this bogus narrative, articles in the mainstream newspapers, public health experts, so-called, just kind of positing this as if, again, it had been at all factually established, which it hadn't. I mean, just to give you one example, and I could have listed countless. There's this gentleman named Eric Topol, who is one of the most widely cited, quasi epidemiologists on social media since the onset of COVID. He went on a podcast a few days ago and said that, quote, only in recent days, interestingly, have they, meaning Republicans, started to come out with a message that this is important, meaning that the vaccine is important. Now, if that were true, that would be certainly odd and definitely worth remarking upon. I mean, if it was the case that only in the past week did Republican elected officials start advocating vaccine uptake, That would certainly be startling, but it's just false. And it's so easily disproven that it really gives you some insight into just how thoughtlessly, just how brazenly these incredibly nonsensical narratives can be constructed. And again, that's significant irrespective of your view on the desirability of the vaccine or the efficacy of the vaccine or anything to do with the actual mechanism of the vaccine. That's not relevant here. The question here has to do with media distortion and to what end that distortion is being concocted. Now, I went through and made a list, a non-exhaustive list of, roughly speaking, the most prominent Republican elected officials in the country. And it's striking how essentially unanimous they are in their support and promotion and advocacy of the vaccine. So that's just the case. That's just the factual reality. Again, totally notwithstanding your other views on the vaccine itself or policy issues surrounding the vaccine. Number one example, which you'd think would be so blaringly obvious that it wouldn't even have to be noted. And this example causes a lot of cognitive dissonance across the political spectrum for obvious reasons. But the number one example of one of the country's highest profile, if not the highest profile, vaccine proponents is, you may have heard of him, Donald Trump. Okay? Donald Trump has been unequivocal in his advocacy of the vaccine. It's just the case. He's been on Fox News, which is supposedly this miasma of misinformation that has been causing such problems, allegedly, in dissuading people from taking the vaccine. Donald Trump, who I think everybody would agree is the most influential Republican in the country, he's been on Fox News on multiple occasions, not in July, not just recently, but months ago, advocating for his supporters to take the vaccine. That's just true. Go to my Substack, which is linked in the description box of this video, and you can get the citations. Okay? At CPAC, the big conference where Trump made his first appearance since leaving office back in February, Trump implored, quote, "Everybody go get your shot." Not a lot of equivocation there. When he was on Fox, this was in March, not July, March, right around the time that the vaccines started to become widely available to the general public. Trump said, quote, "It's a safe vaccine," and, quote, "it works." And he urged all Americans to get it. This is just what he's saying. So whatever certain factions of Trump supporters may believe about the vaccine, again, not relevant. Donald Trump himself is a chief proponent of the vaccine, and that's just what's established by the factual record. Now, the reason it provokes a lot of cognitive dissonance is because there is a contingent of Trump supporters who are antagonistic toward the vaccine. To call it hesitant or to call their attitude hesitancy would be an understatement. They are firmly opposed to the vaccine, which, okay, fine. But Donald Trump is not. And the basis for this phony narrative that the media invented was that prominent Republican elected officials had only recently begun to advocate the vaccine. But then the most influential Republican in the country disproves that. That's just the truth. And on the other side, it provokes cognitive dissonance because Trump's detractors are very, kind of violently resistant to giving him credit for anything. And not that credit really even matters that much, quote unquote. I mean, credit, which is like, it's a pundit currency almost. Like you dole out who deserves credit for various accomplishments, but it doesn't mean anything. But that said, there's this intense aversion to giving Trump credit for anything. And that notwithstanding, it is the case that Trump presided over and spearheaded Operation Warp Speed, which was this public-private partnership initiative that the federal government undertook in 2020 to expedite the manufacture and provision of COVID vaccines on a time scale that was radically faster than anything that had ever been attempted before in history. And Trump oversaw that. He just did. So you cannot like that, or you can like it, whether you're a supporter or opponent, but you should probably acknowledge that it's just what happened. It's true. And so it makes no sense from the standpoint of this idiotic Republicans all of a sudden had an epiphany on vaccines narrative that has been promoted at full force this past week or so. So that's number one. And I mean, you could go on. Mike Pence, pretty high profile Republican, wouldn't you say? And I know a lot of Trump supporters now revile him because he supposedly did not act in accordance with Trump's wishes at the ceremonial certification of the Electoral College on January 6th. But regardless, prior to that, in December, Pence went on TV and got the vaccine in front of the cameras and touted it, and even framed his praise of the vaccine in terms of traditional conservative policy goals, because he said that the Trump administration was, which was true, was able to cut red tape and get the vaccine produced on an expedited schedule. That's another one. Ron DeSantis, okay, another very high-profile Republican. When vaccines first became available, this was back again in December, DeSantis said, "We are working to get as much vaccine for our citizens as possible." And of course, as a governor, DeSantis has administered his state's vaccine program. So he's been in charge of Florida's vaccine distribution program from the outset. Now, if that doesn't kind of support, I don't know what would. But again, that's just true. And on top of that, all 27 Republican governors in the country, so more than half of all states' governors are Republicans, and all of them, literally all of them, I checked, okay, literally all of them have been unabashed in their advocacy of the vaccines. Meaning they supported the vaccines, they've administered the distribution of the vaccines in their states. They personally have all taken the vaccines, including DeSantis. By the way, also, Trump says he took the vaccine. So, again, this narrative makes no sense because you would have to ignore, in order to believe the whole nonsense Republicans only recently became to support the vaccine narrative, you'd have to ignore that a majority of states in the U.S. are run by Republicans who are in charge of their state's vaccine distribution programs. Again, that's just true.